All right, well, welcome back. Let's carry on with our reading of The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell. We're still working in the introduction. Maybe we'll finish that tonight. Let's see. Carrying on where we left off, the usual strategy, of course, is to read the preceding paragraph if we're midway in a paragraph. So I finished on the introduction, page 23, and then it's right in between what looks like a poem. Let's try it again. Pardon me. A man may write at any time if he will set himself doggedly to it. This was a good dinner enough, to be sure, but it was not a dinner to ask a man to. A man should keep his... Oh, these were select comments. That's right. These were select comments that someone had picked out from... I'll have to read back up a little further. Here we go. So let's begin a little further up. Professor Podel, in the understanding passage about Boswell, already quoted, speaks of how, in reading Boswell's journal, we are likely to find ourselves in something that Boswell tells us about himself with a frankness that rather astonishes and perhaps somewhat frightens us. I just can't get over the difficulty of this reading. The person that wrote the introduction is just it doesn't work well with my mind. Something of the sort is true of Johnson, but in a rather different way. Who can read Johnson's conversations, his letters, or his works, without treasuring them for their skillful wording, their enormous common sense, their satirical penetration, their wit, their intelligence, and without relishing many of them as amazingly pertinent to one's own behavior, personality, and experience? For example, so a selection of Johnson's writings. A man may write at any time if he will set himself doggedly to it. I'm going to have to remember that one. This was a good dinner enough, to be sure, but it was not a dinner to ask a man to. A man should keep his friendship in constant repair. I hope I will never be deterred from detecting what I think a cheat by the menaces of a ruffian. Well, I hope I will never be deterred from detecting what I think a cheat by the menaces of a ruffian. It matters not how a man dies, but how he lives. That fellow seemed to me to possess but one idea, and that is a wrong one. Every man has a lurking wish to appear considerable in his native place. Interesting. A man will turn over half a library to make one book. Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Interesting. Knowledge is of two kinds. We know a subject ourselves, or we know where we can find information upon it. Carrying on, so it wasn't poem, just carrying on from the select quotes of Johnson. Another popular misconception about Johnson is that he was somehow the invention of Boswell. That from what Boswell imagined, that from what Boswell managed to find out about a man who would otherwise have been an obscure and mediocre background figure in the literary and subliterary life of the period. Boswell created a colossus and persuaded the world to accept his creation as the man himself. Wow, I've never heard that before. That this was not true is readily shown by even the slight acquaintance with the enormous body of material about Boswell and Johnson. If it were true, however, it would only demonstrate a further aspect of Boswell's versatility. For any writer of fiction or drama who could create a character like Johnson, or who could successfully write a fictionalized biography built around a more or less fictionalized character like Johnson, placed against a historically authentic background, would surely be a remarkable writer and deserve a high place in literature. Wow, what an interesting idea. I'd never heard the idea that Johnson might have been an invention of Boswell's. But that if he is, then all the more praise to Boswell for pulling it off. Johnson's melancholy is a subject that seems to be of more interest today than it ever was. Melancholy, in some of its various senses, especially as mere boredom or some variety of mild depression, was a fashionable 18th century complaint. Mrs. Thrall complained of it to Johnson, as did Boswell. The evidence is clear that neither of them ever knew the terrifying, severe depression that Johnson experienced from time to time. Wow, I'd heard of his depression, but I didn't know it was that bad. According to Hawkins, Johnson thought he had inherited this from his father. Its first crisis seems to have come in 1729, when he was 20 years old. He left Oxford and consulted a Birmingham doctor who informed him, after reading a full description of his symptoms in Latin, that they clearly pointed towards madness. There was another crisis towards the middle of 1766, which the Thralls comprehended well enough to invite him to come live with them at Streatham. Johnson's depression never became psychotic. It was the sort of severe depression that leaves one bewildered and desperate and terrified in some suburb of hell, but that does not push one into hell itself. It was in such a mood that Johnson bought and one day gave to Mrs. Thrall to keep for him such a padlock as was used to fasten the manacles which confined the insane in 18th century asylums. Wow, that's interesting. Johnson was never insane, and we shall never know how close he may have come to insanity. We do know that he desperately feared insanity. This, or declarations by Johnson in severe depression that he was indeed insane, was the secret that Mrs. Thrall only confided to her Thrallia in 1785, after his death. Poor Johnson, I see they will leave nothing untold that I labored so long to keep secret. And I was so very delicate in trying to conceal his fancied insanity that I retained no proofs of it, or hardly any, nor even mentioned it in these books, lest by my dying first they might be printed in the secret for such I thought it discovered. Johnson had confided his fear to others. Tyers, in 1784, in his periodical sketch, spoke of Johnson's convulsive seizures and revealed that he was afraid of his disorders seizing his head, and took all possible care that his understanding should not be deranged. And Hawkins, in his Life in 1787, spoke of Johnson's dread of such a calamity. Nothing is more admirable about Johnson than that he managed somehow to last out these periods of severe depression. However he contrived it, his mind never went under long enough to incapacitate or to kill him. Wow, I had no idea that it was that bad for him. Macaulay remarked of Johnson in the last paragraph of his Encyclopedia Britannica article that Boswell's book has done for him more than the best of his own books could do. The memory of other authors is kept alive by their works, but the memory of Johnson keeps many of his works alive. We value Johnson, he is saying, and primarily because of Boswell, as a man rather than for what he wrote. This is the typical 19th century judgment, and until recently it has precluded all others. In 1907, Walter Raleigh, professor of English at Oxford, began the last paragraph of his Leslie Stephen lecture on Johnson with this statement: "This is the greatness of Johnson, that he is greater than his works. He thought of himself as a man, not as an author, and of literature as a means and not an end in itself." On the other hand, we find such conclusions as these by Professor James L. Clifford of Columbia University in 1958. What our age needs is a better understanding of the deep wisdom and sanity contained in Johnson's writings. It is in his works that Johnson's significance lies. He was a major writer, one of the great figures of English literature. It is in his writings, rather than in the witty, explosive remarks so marvelously set down by Boswell, that Johnson has most to say to our generation. I hope that's true. If today we had only a slight knowledge of Johnson, the man, as we might have of many a writer, we would not be likely to find him as a man particularly memorable. If we knew him today only through his works, we would value him more highly than he was customarily valued for at least a century, say 1825 to 1925. We are already within a quarter century of the 200th anniversary of his death. For us, he is not, on the one hand, Johnson the author, and on the other, Johnson the great. Johnson, the subject of Boswell's great life. For us, he is admirable and great, because he was a remarkable and great man, a greatness which shows itself in Boswell's record of his life, and on page after page of his writings, including his letters. Macaulay's assertion that the life would be read as long as the English language is known, we feel to be as true of prophecy today as when Macaulay made it. Boswell's life has assuredly made both Johnson and his biographer immortal figures. It is impossible to imagine a time when Boswell's life will not be read, for it is a greatly told life of a great man. Edward J. Fletcher. So we've completed the introduction. It was 26 pages. Introduction complete. Now we're going to begin a note on the text. And I think I'm going to stop for tonight. It's about 3 or 4 pages. 3 or 4 pages, and then we can actually get into it. Tomorrow I need to go to the office, so I'm going to go get my sleep in. And if you're wondering if I dog-eared these pages, I sure do. I tend to abuse my books, except the very old ones, the old antiques. I leave those alone. This is only from 1963, so it gets a whipping. Thanks for joining me. We'll read some more next time. Take care. Oh, I should see if there's any comments. Nope. Oh, hello, Kurt Little 5. Hi, hello. Thanks for joining me. Take care.